I want to start with a message I read 4 words of before I had to put my phone down. It came from Petra, which meant I read it. I always read Petra's messages because she was one of the few people from that part of my life who had stayed in genuine contact through the 3 years of absence, and because ignoring Petra felt like ignoring someone who had specifically decided not to make me choose, which was a gift I hadn't been fully able to receive, but had never stopped being grateful for. The message was about a gathering, a reunion. She called it not a formal thing, just the group getting together the way the group used to get together, at someone's apartment, the kind of evening that used to be so regular it didn't even need a name, and now needed to be described as a reunion, because 3 years had passed and people had moved and things had changed, and the easiest shorthand was, everyone back in the same room, everyone, and then the 4 words. Owen said he hopes you'll come. I put my phone face down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not because the words were devastating, because they told me something about where we'd both landed that I hadn't had direct information about in a long time. He was still at the center of it, still the one whose opinion of the invitation circulated back to the person being invited. Still generous in the way that people are generous when they're not the ones who left. Still hoping, which meant he still thought about whether I might show up, which meant the 3 years had existed for him too in ways I hadn't let myself think about. Owen said he hopes you'll come. 4 words that contained an entire geography of who we still were to each other, and what that room still meant. Have you ever lost a whole social world when a relationship ended? Not just the person, the entire community that came with them. The shared apartment buildings and the inside jokes and the group text you eventually had to mute because you were still in it and it was full of a life you'd left? Tell me where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe, because I'm going to tell you the whole thing. And the whole thing takes a while. Let me tell you about the group first, because the group is the part that matters. There were 7 of us at the peak of it, give or take. The number fluctuated, people drifted in and out the way people do in their early 20s, when everyone is figuring out their social landscape, but the core held at around 7. We had met in various configurations through college and the years immediately after, when you're in that window of life where you're done with the structure school provided, and you're building the structure of adulthood from scratch. And the people you find in that window become something more than friends because you're all doing it at the same time. We lived near each other. That was the thing that made us real, not just people who texted and occasionally got together, but people who lived within walking distance and actually walked to each other's places. Half of us were in the same building or on the same street. The proximity created a texture to daily life that I've only ever had with that particular group, and I've spent 3 years understanding what it means to not have it. Owen was the reason I found them. Not the only reason. I would have found some of them eventually through other paths, but the direct reason. The person who took me by the wrist, metaphorically, and said, "These are my people," and meant, "Come be part of this." We met at the end of the first year after college, when I was lonely in the particular way of someone who has just left an institution that provided everything and is now having to provide everything themselves. He was warm in the specific way of a person who makes you feel like being seen is easy. Like you're not something that requires effort. I want to describe Owen accurately, because this story is easier if he's a villain, and he was not a villain. He was the kind of person who walked into a room and the room shifted. Not dramatically, nothing that could be called charisma in the performative sense. More like, he was fully present in every conversation, in a way that made the person he was talking to feel like the conversation was the thing he'd been looking forward to. He listened like he meant it. He remembered things about people, specific things, the kind of details that signaled genuine attention. He was funny without needing to be the funniest person in the room, which is actually a harder quality to have. He was also, and this is the part I took longest to understand, the kind of person who doesn't do any of this deliberately, and who therefore cannot fully see its effect. He didn't try to be at the center of things. He didn't position himself or manage his social standing. He just was himself. And himself happened to be the kind of self that rooms organized around, which meant that when you were with him, when you were his person, you were by association also at the center of something. And that felt like a specific kind of warmth that I want to describe carefully, so I don't make it sound shallow, because it wasn't shallow. It was the warmth of belonging, of being part of a world rather than adjacent to one. I had been adjacent to a lot of worlds in my life before that, and being inside one felt like something I hadn't known I was missing. We were together for a year and a half. I want to tell you something about how the year and a half ended, because the ending is important for understanding the rest. It didn't end because someone was bad to someone else. It didn't end because of a betrayal or a lie or any of the things that produce clean grief with a clear cause. It ended in the way that things end when two people slowly understand that what they have isn't going to be what either of them needs, and the understanding arrives gradually, and by the time it's fully arrived, both people have already been grieving it for a while without saying so. The conversation we had was hard in the way honest conversations are hard, harder than a fight would have been, because a fight would have given us something to point to. What we had instead was two people sitting across from each other and acknowledging, carefully, that the thing we'd built wasn't going to become the thing we'd imagined, that what we wanted in a life together didn't match as well as what we wanted in an evening together, that we liked each other too much and fit each other too specifically and not specifically enough, both at once. After that conversation, the practical question arrived. What now? Not emotionally. Emotionally, I knew what now. What now for the group? What now for the 7 people I had come into through him, whose apartments I had keys to, whose birthdays I knew, who had become part of my daily life in a way that felt like my life was made of them? What do you do with that when the person who was your door into it is now the person you've just carefully and mutually decided to not be with? I looked at the shape of the situation. I tried to be honest about it. What I saw was this. Owen would stay at the center, not because he would try to stay there, not because he would do anything to consolidate position or manage perceptions. He would stay there because that was what happened naturally with him, the room organized around him without anyone deciding it should. And if I was there too, in the same physical and social space, I would inevitably be adjacent to him, his ex, navigating the same group, in the same building, attending the same casual Tuesday evenings. That was survivable. Probably. But it was also I understood this about myself, though not in words I had at the time, not something I knew how to do. I didn't know how to be in a space that organized itself around someone I had loved and was no longer with. I didn't know how to be there as myself, without the relationship as the reason for my being there. So I left, not all at once. I want to be honest about the process because the all-at-once version makes it sound more like a decision, and it was more like a series of small choices, each of which was individually defensible and collectively produced an outcome. I declined a gathering, then another. I responded to the group text less, then stopped responding. When Petra specifically texted me to ask if everything was okay, I said yes. I was just busy. I'd be around soon. I wasn't around soon. I told myself it was temporary, that I needed time and then I'd come back. That wasn't what happened. What happened was that the absence became its own state. 3 months became 6, became a year, and then it had been so long that showing up would have required an explanation, and not showing up didn't require anything. The path of least resistance was to stay away. I stayed away. 3 years. I want to tell you that I thought about the group during those 3 years, because I did. Not constantly. Not with the open wound quality of recent grief. More like the occasional awareness of something you've walked away from, a pang. A flash of recognition when something reminded me of them. A moment at a party with new people where I'd think, this would have been that kind of evening. The kind we used to have. And then I'd file it and move on. I'd built something new. A different social world. Smaller. Built in different ways. Without the density of proximity that the old one had. It was real. It was good. I wasn't walking around bereft. But Petra's message sat on my phone. Owen said he hopes you'll come. And underneath the warmth of the words was a geography I hadn't thought about in a while, the specific apartment it would be in, the specific people who would be there, the specific way a Tuesday evening in that context felt different from a Tuesday evening anywhere else I had been in 3 years. I picked up the phone. I read the message again. I put the phone face down. I didn't delete the message. I didn't respond. I just left it there, on the other side of the screen, and let the question it contained be a question for a little while longer. Owen said he hopes you'll come. I had spent 3 years making sure that the geography of my daily life didn't require me to answer questions like that one. I had organized my absence carefully, and the message was asking me whether the organizing was still something I wanted to keep doing. I didn't know. That was the first time in 3 years that I genuinely didn't know. Usually I had the answer ready. Not going was easy, required nothing, produced no friction. But something about the message and the 4 specific words in it and the image they produced of Owen saying them to Petra to say to me had cracked the usual certainty a little, and I was sitting with the crack, in my apartment, looking at the ceiling, The invitation would expire if I didn't respond. The gathering would happen. People would note my absence in whatever way they noted it, and nothing would change. That was still available. But for the first time in 3 years, I was sitting with the question of whether I wanted it to be. The message stayed on my phone for 3 days. Not because I was deliberating in an active way. I wasn't sitting with a pros and cons list. Wasn't running through scenarios. More like I was letting the question exist in the background while I went about the ordinary structure of my days, occasionally becoming aware of it the way you become aware of something you've left unresolved. The message was there. I hadn't responded. I hadn't deleted it. That was the whole of my position for 72 hours. On the third day, Marcus came over to watch a film, which we did sometimes on weekday evenings when neither of us had anything more structured planned. He brought food. I had already eaten but ate some of his anyway because that's what you do when someone brings food, and we sat on the couch and debated which thing to watch for 20 minutes before landing on something neither of us had seen and ending up talking over it within the first half hour because we always ended up talking over things. At some point, not quite naturally, I was aware of steering toward it. I told him about the message. Not the history first. Just the message. I read it to him from my phone. Everyone's asking about you. Owen said he hopes you'll come. Marcus listened. He had a particular quality when he was actually paying attention, which was that he got slightly more still, the way some people do when they've decided to receive something properly. He looked at me when I finished. "Who's Owen?" he asked, which was the moment I realized I hadn't told him. In the year and a half of our friendship, I had mentioned the old group in passing, had referenced having a different social world before this one, had probably implied that a relationship ending was part of why things had shifted, but I hadn't told Marcus about Owen in the specific way that Owen needed to be explained to make the message make sense. So I told him. The version I told was accurate but not exhaustive. The shape of things, the year and a half, the group that had been as much a part of the relationship as the relationship itself, the logic of why leaving felt cleaner than staying, the 3 years that had accumulated on top of the decision. I told it as straightforwardly as I could, which is the way I'd learned to tell things to Marcus, because Marcus was the kind of friend who asked questions rather than offering conclusions, and the questions were easier to answer honestly than the conclusions would have been to receive. He listened through all of it. When I finished, he didn't say anything right away. He picked up his food, ate something, put it back down. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "Okay." He seemed to accept that as an actual answer, rather than a deflection. "Do you miss them? The people?" Not Owen, specifically the group. I opened my mouth to say something and then stopped, because the something I was going to say was of course, but the of course arrived with a texture I hadn't expected, not the easy certainty of answering a question you've thought about before, the weight of answering a question you've been specifically not thinking about. "Yeah," I said. "I think I do." "You think?" "I know," I said. "I just haven't let myself. It was easier not to go there." Marcus nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet I could feel him sitting with something, not deciding whether to say it. Marcus was never uncertain about whether to say things, just choosing how. "It sounds like you left a relationship and then also left everything else as collateral," he said. "And now you're being invited back to the everything else and you're not sure if that's separate from the relationship or the same thing." I looked at him. "That's a pretty accurate read," I said. "The 3 years seems like a long time to leave collateral," he said. Not as a judgment, just the observation. "I know. What were you protecting?" I sat with that question longer than was comfortable. The honest answer was, I didn't know, or I did know, and hadn't said it out loud. I was protecting the thing that might happen if I went back to being adjacent to Owen in the specific way of someone who used to be his person and now wasn't. The attending an event where he's there and navigating whatever version of myself existed in relation to that. The possibility of being in a room and feeling again like I belonged there only because of him and not knowing how to belong there for any other reason. That was what I'd been protecting against. 3 years of it. I didn't know how to be there without him being the reason I was there, I said. Marcus looked at me. "And is he still the reason you'd be going?" I didn't answer immediately because I was trying to find out if the answer was yes. It wasn't. Or it was more complicated than yes. Owen was the reason the question existed without Owen. The group existed in a form I'd never have found, and the message wouldn't have had the specific 4 words that had cracked the usual certainty. But was he the reason I'd go? I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go despite him or because of him or for reasons that didn't include him at all. I'm not sure, I said. Sounds like you should figure that out before you decide, Marcus said, and then turned back to the film, which was a very Marcus way of having a conversation, getting the thing said and then returning to whatever they'd been doing, as if the important part was the saying and not the aftermath. I stayed at Marcus's for another couple of hours, watching the film I wasn't watching, thinking about what he'd said. I had left a relationship, and then I had also left a community, a context, a version of my daily life. I had done the second thing in service of protecting myself from the difficulty of the first thing, and I had been so focused on whether the first thing was manageable that I had never thought to ask whether the second thing had to happen at all. Petra called the following week. She was someone who preferred calls to texts for certain kinds of conversation. I knew this about her, had always known it, and when her name appeared as a call rather than a text, I understood that this was one of the certain kinds. I answered. I wanted to actually hear your voice, she said. Her voice had the specific warmth of someone I'd known well and hadn't talked to enough. It's been too long. Yeah, I said. I know. Is it always going to be weird for you to answer things from us? She asked. Not unkindly. Just directly. Because that was Petra. I hope not. I said. I'm working on it. She was quiet for a moment. And then she did what Petra always did when she decided to say a true thing. She said it, without building up to it. I've been your friend this whole time, she said. I've also been Owen's friend. I want you to know I haven't been choosing. I've been in the middle, which has sometimes been uncomfortable, but I've stayed there on purpose because I think you're both people I want to stay in contact with. I know, I said. I've always known that. Okay. She paused. Then I want to tell you something that I've been sitting on for a while, because I think you should know it before you decide whether to come. Okay. Owen's fine, she said. He's himself, which means he's doing well by most measures, because that's who he is. But he's also been in the same apartment, with the same people, in a world that used to include the two of you as a unit, and now it doesn't. And he's been navigating that just as much as you have, just in a different direction. I held the phone and thought about that. I assumed he just stayed, I said. I assumed staying was easier for him. Staying meant being in a world that had the absence of you built into it, she said. Everyone who cared about you and was also his friend. Every time someone mentioned you or asked about you or wanted to reconnect and he had to navigate that, he didn't get to build something new. He stayed with the thing that had a shape of you missing from it. I hadn't thought about it that way. The thought I'd had, for 3 years, was, Owen was at the center and I was on the outside. And being at the center was winning, and being on the outside was losing. But the geometry was more complicated than that. He had gotten to keep the geography. I had gotten to start fresh. Both of those things had costs that I'd only been thinking about from my own side. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Not defensively, genuinely, because I want you to come to this gathering as yourself, she said. Not as Owen's ex who's been invited back. Not as someone who's making peace with something. Just as Sam, who I've missed and who I'd like to see again. And I think if you're going to do that, you need to stop thinking about him as the person who stayed at the center and understand that he's also been dealing with it. The call lasted for another 40 minutes after that. We talked about other things, her life, what the group had been doing, the practical details of who was coming and when and where. By the time we got off the phone, the sun had shifted and my apartment was in the specific late afternoon light that I associated with the end of work and the beginning of evenings. I sat in it for a while. The 3 years had been genuinely built. I wanted to say that clearly, to myself and to whatever version of this I was working through. The life I'd made after leaving wasn't a placeholder or a waiting room. I had friends I trusted, work I was interested in, a sense of where things were and who I was in relation to them. I hadn't been surviving. I had been living, but I had been living in a way that was organized, quietly and without announcement, around an absence. Every decision not to respond to a group message, every event in that part of my life that I hadn't attended, every time I'd run the calculation and decided the calculation came out to staying away. I had been organizing my life around the choice I'd made 3 years ago rather than making new choices, and the choice 3 years ago had been about Owen, which meant that Owen was still, in a specific and architectural sense, at the center of things, not in the way of the group, not because of anything he'd done, but because I had arranged my absence around him the same way I'd feared I'd arrange my presence. He was the thing I was navigating. Even when I wasn't there to navigate anything, I picked up my phone. The message from Petra was still there. I scrolled back to it and read it again. Everyone's asking about you. Owen said he hopes you'll come. Below it, Petra's number sat in my recent calls. I opened a new message to Petra. Typed 2 words. Read them back. I'm coming. My thumb hovered over send. I thought about the way Marcus had framed it, not the relationship, the everything else that had been collateral. I thought about what Petra had said about Owen navigating an absence. I thought about 3 years of organizing my life around a decision and whether I wanted a 4th. I pressed send. The message went through immediately. A delivered receipt appeared. I put the phone down and noticed, before I could think about it too clearly, that something in my chest had moved when I pressed send. Not relief, and not dread, and not quite excitement. Something more like the specific sensation of having said something real after a long time of not saying it. I sat with that for a while. Not sure if it was good. Sure it was true. Petra responded within a minute. A single emoji. Something warm and slightly relieved, which was the Petra version of not making a big deal out of something while also making clear it was a big deal. I put the phone down and did not let myself overthink the decision. This was deliberate. I had a tendency, which I had learned about myself over the 3 years, to think things into immobility, to examine a choice from enough angles that the examination became its own form of avoidance. I had made the decision. The overthinking could wait until I was actually in the room and had something real to respond to rather than something imagined. The gathering was on a Saturday. I spent the week working, seeing Marcus once for coffee, existing in the ordinary structure of my days. I didn't talk about it with Marcus again. He had given me what he'd given me, and I had taken it, and we both seemed to understand that the rest of it was mine to do. That was one of the things I valued about him. He knew when to step back. The apartment was one I'd been in many times before it became somewhere I'd stopped going. The same building, the same floor, the same door. Walking up the stairs on Saturday evening, I noticed how completely familiar everything was. The specific sound of the stairwell, the way the hallway light buzzed faintly on the 3rd floor, the smell that was just the building-specific smell, and that I hadn't smelled in 3 years but recognized immediately. I was slightly early, which had not been my plan. I'd meant to arrive in the middle of the gathering, when there would already be people and noise and I could slide into something already in progress rather than standing in a doorway being the first arrival who had to be greeted specifically. But the subway had been faster than expected and I was there earlier than I'd intended, which meant I had 5 minutes on the landing outside the door, making peace with arriving first. I knocked. Petra opened the door. She looked at me for a second, just a second, with the expression of someone seeing something they'd been waiting for and had half convinced themselves wasn't going to arrive. Then she hugged me. And it was the real kind, not the social kind. You came, she said. Not accusatorially. Just the fact. Received. I came, I said. I was not first. I had worried about being first. There were already 5 or 6 people in the living room, and as I walked in, there was a moment, maybe 3 seconds, where the room registered my presence, and several conversations paused in the way conversations pause when something changes. And then people were saying my name and coming toward me, and it was not awkward in the way I had imagined it might be. It was warm. Genuinely warm. I want to describe this carefully because I think the accuracy matters. I had spent 3 years constructing an image of what returning would feel like, the imagined awkwardness, the navigating of history, the being perceived as Owen's ex in a room full of people who remembered us as a unit. What actually happened when I walked in was that people were glad to see me. Not in the way that required managing. In the way that someone is glad to see a person they've been missing. Straightforwardly, without subtext. I had been gone. They had noticed the being gone. They were glad about the being back. It was, in some ways, harder to receive than the awkwardness would have been. Awkwardness I had prepared for. Uncomplicated gladness required me to accept that my absence had been felt and that my presence was wanted, and I had spent 3 years getting comfortable with the idea that I wasn't expected. Owen was there. I had known he would be. I had tried to prepare for it, and had come to the conclusion, around Thursday, that preparation wasn't something you could do effectively for something like this. You just had to walk into it and be in it. He was across the room when I came in, talking to someone, not looking at the door. He looked up at the shift in the room's attention, the way you look up when something has changed in the ambient noise of a gathering. And he saw me. We looked at each other across the room. He nodded. It was a small nod. not elaborate. Something that said, "You're here. I see you're here. I'm glad you're here. We don't have to make it more than that right now." I nodded back, and then he went back to his conversation, and I went back to the people who had come toward me, and the moment was done. It was the first time I'd seen him in 3 years. I had imagined that moment many times, not deliberately, not as something I sought out, but in the way that you imagine things you're avoiding when you don't expect to. The imagined version had always been too weighted, too significant, the kind of movie moment where two people make eye contact and the soundtrack changes. The actual version was a nod, and the nod was the right version. It was exactly enough. The evening did what these evenings had always done. It moved through stages. Conversations formed and dissolved and reformed in different configurations. Someone put music on. Food appeared. I had forgotten how much I'd liked the specific energy of this group when it was gathered together. They were funny in the way of people who had known each other long enough to have a shared comedic language. They were interested in each other in a genuine way. There was a quality to the room that I had been unable to find or replicate elsewhere, not because I hadn't found good people, but because this particular accumulation of specific people had something that was theirs and not transferable. I found myself in a conversation with two people, Kara and Dimitri, both of whom I'd known since the beginning of the group, that had nothing to do with anything I'd been carrying about the evening. We were talking about something Kara was dealing with at work, a situation with a colleague that was frustrating and slightly absurd, and Dimitri was making observations that kept landing in the exact right place, and I was laughing in the way that happens when you're actually present and not monitoring yourself. At some point I realized I had been in the conversation for 20 minutes, and had not once thought about Owen or about the 3 years or about anything except what we were talking about. I was just in the room. It was somewhere around 9 o'clock that Owen came to sit near me, not beside me, near me, on the other end of the couch, when a conversation that had been happening there wound down and people moved on to other parts of the room, and we were both just there for a moment. I could have moved. He could have moved. Neither of us did. "I'm glad you came," he said. His voice was the voice I remembered. That was the most disorienting thing about seeing someone after a long absence, not the ways they've changed, but the ways they haven't. He sounded exactly like himself, which was both obvious and somehow not something I'd been prepared for. "I should have come sooner," I said, and heard myself say it, and recognized it as true. He looked at me, not with the weight of 3 years in it, or not only that, more like someone checking whether the statement was accurate and deciding it was. "You left because you needed to," he said. I understood that. "Did you?" I asked, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. I understood the logic of it, he said. I understood why staying would have been hard. I didn't understand. He paused, and in the pause I could see him deciding how much of a true thing to say. I didn't understand at first why it had to be so complete, the whole thing, everyone and everything. I didn't know how to separate them, I said. You and the group. You were the reason I was there. When we weren't, I stopped. Found the words. I didn't know how to be there for any other reason. I didn't know if I had any other reason. He was quiet for a moment. You did, he said. People liked you for you. That was never about me. I know that now, I said. I didn't know how to believe it then. We sat with that for a moment. The party was happening around us, the specific ambient warmth of people enjoying each other's company in a small space. Someone laughed loudly in the kitchen. The music had shifted to something easier. I'm not going to pretend the 3 years were nothing, Owen said. Or that having you just not be around didn't change things. I know, I said. But I'm also not, he stopped again. I'm not angry. I don't think I was ever really angry. I was sad for a while. And then, that passed. And it was just, he gestured, vaguely. I hope you've been okay. I have been, I said. Mostly, he said. A small, real smile. That's honest. I smiled too. And for a moment the years between us didn't feel like they required accounting for. They had happened. They were in the room with us. And they didn't need to be managed or resolved or turned into something cleaner than they were. I kept thinking about how to come back in a way that wasn't about you, I said. And I couldn't figure it out. And now I'm here and it's... I looked around the room. You're just one person in the room. He looked at me. I'm going to take that as a compliment, he said. It was, I said. He moved on after that. Someone called him from across the room. One of those moments where someone wants to include you in a conversation happening elsewhere. And he went. And I stayed on my section of the couch and watched him go and thought, that was the conversation. And it was the right size. Not the 3 years conversation. Not the accounting conversation. Just two people sitting near each other at a party, saying the true things that needed saying. And then the party continuing. I got a glass of water from the kitchen and stood there for a moment, looking at the room from the kitchen doorway, and something arrived that I hadn't been expecting. I was watching people talk. I was watching the group be the group, the specific texture of it, the way conversations overlapped, the way people moved through the space with the ease of long familiarity. I was watching it from the kitchen doorway, and I was watching it as someone who was there, who had been invited and had come, who was part of this evening even though I hadn't been part of the 3 years leading up to it. And I understood, standing there, what I had been wrong about. I had left because I didn't know how to be there without Owen being the reason. I had stayed away because returning felt like it would be about Owen, about navigating his presence, about being in a space that organized itself around him and not knowing how to be anything in relation to that. But the space had never been organized around Owen. Not entirely. It was organized around this room, these people, this specific accumulation of relationships that had been building for years. Owen was part of it. He was a significant part of it. But the group was not Owen, and Owen was not the group, and I had been treating them as the same thing for 3 years because it was easier to think about leaving as leaving one thing rather than leaving many. I had made him the whole thing, and he had never been the whole thing. He'd always just been one person in the room. The room had been mine too. I had given it up as if it were his to give, and it hadn't been his to give. I went back to the couch. I sat with Kara for another half hour, talking about the kind of things you talk about when you're catching up with someone after a long gap and finding that the gap hasn't made them into a stranger. And then I was in another conversation, and then another. I left around 11:30, when people were starting to wind down in the gradual way of gatherings that have gone well. I said goodbye to everyone, and the goodbyes had the warmth of things that were being continued rather than closed. In the taxi home, I stared out the window and let the city move past. I took out my phone before I'd really decided to. Marcus picked up on the third ring. "How was it?" he said. "Really good," I said. And then, because it was Marcus, and because the thing needed to be said to someone, and also I think I've been organizing my life around someone who left it 3 years ago. "A pause. Owen," he said. "The idea of Owen," I said. "Which is different." I could hear him take that in. "Yeah," he said. After a moment, "I think I see what you mean." I looked out the taxi window. The city was doing its nighttime things, ordinary and ongoing, the way it always was. "I need to think about what that means," I said. "But I think I'm starting to." "Good," Marcus said. "That sounds like a good place to start." The thinking took a few weeks. Not the dramatic kind of thinking. Not the kind where you sit in a specific chair with a journal and work through things in order. Just the ambient kind, the thoughts that arrive while you're making coffee, while you're on the subway, while you're doing something with your hands that doesn't require all of your brain. The understanding that had arrived in the taxi was real, and I was letting it find its edges. Find out what it meant practically. Find out what it asked of me. What it asked of me, it turned out, was not very dramatic either. It asked me to stop treating the group as a place I could only visit by special permission, to stop approaching Petra's texts as if they were diplomatic communiques requiring careful response rather than messages from a friend, to stop running the calculation every time an invitation arrived, the calculation that had always started from, "This is Owen's world. Do I belong in it? What is my standing here?" and start from something simpler, which was, do I want to go? Do I have something to offer? Will I be glad I went? Those were different starting points, and they produced different answers. I started showing up again. Not in a way that required announcement or explanation. I just started responding to Petra's texts with the quickness of someone who wasn't managing them. Started saying yes when an evening sounded good. Started treating the group as a place I went rather than a place I had to decide to go. The first few times had the slight self-consciousness of someone learning to move through a space differently than they had before. I was aware of myself doing it, which meant I wasn't quite doing it naturally, which was fine. Natural was something that developed with repetition, not something you arrived at by willing it. By the third or fourth gathering, I mostly wasn't tracking it anymore. I want to tell you about one specific evening, about 6 weeks after the reunion, because I think it captures something important. It was a Tuesday. Not a special Tuesday, nobody had organized anything. It was just one of those gatherings that coalesced the way they used to coalesce. When the group was a daily life kind of presence rather than a formal occasion, Petra had texted the group chat saying she had too much pasta and people should come eat it, which was the specific kind of invitation that used to be unremarkable and that I had spent 3 years not receiving. I went. Owen was there. Kara was there. Dimitri. 2 other people from the original group. And 1 person I hadn't met who was apparently a recent addition to the orbit. The evening was the evening. Pasta that Petra had indeed made too much of. A conversation about something in the news that everyone had opinions about. Someone's funny story about something that had happened at work. The music was too loud for a while, and then someone turned it down and nobody remembered to turn it back up, and then it was ambient. About an hour in, I was in a conversation with Kara about something she was trying to decide a job offer. Complicated by geography, the specific kind of thing that sounds like a good problem to have but requires more thought than it appears. I was listening and asking questions and genuinely interested, and at some point Kara said something that made me laugh, and I laughed the full laugh, and when I came back from the laugh I was aware that the evening had the particular quality of being just an evening, not an evening that required navigation, not an evening I was attending despite something, just an evening. Owen was across the room in a different conversation, and I was aware of him the way you're aware of any person you have history with who is in the same room, the background awareness, not the foreground attention. He wasn't the thing I was tracking. He was just there. The way everyone was just there. That was new. Not dramatically new, quietly new, the way things shift when you've changed something about how you're approaching them. 3 months ago, Owen in the room would have been the thing I was navigating around. Now he was one person at a gathering. Part of the texture of the evening rather than the center of gravity I organized myself in relation to. I had moved from satellite to participant. Or I was moving. It wasn't complete. I don't want to oversell the transformation, which would make it less true. There were still moments of the old awareness, flickers of the old calculus, but they were less frequent and they passed faster, and underneath them was something more solid. The recognition that I was here as myself, because I'd chosen to be here, and the choosing was mine. Marcus and I got coffee the following week. He asked how things were going with the group, and I gave him an honest answer. Better, I said. Like genuinely better. Not because Owen and I had some big resolution conversation. We didn't. We had a real one. A real enough one. But it wasn't the thing that changed something. What changed something? He asked. Going back without needing it to be anything, I said. Going back to go back. Not to prove something or fix something. And then going back again. And then again. He nodded. He had the look of someone who had been waiting for this update, and is pleased it sounds like the right one. Can I ask you something? He said. Yeah. Do you regret the 3 years? Staying away? I sat with that for a moment. It was a question I'd been circling around without quite looking at directly. And Marcus asking it directly was the invitation to actually look. Yes and no, I said. I regret the way I framed the choice when I made it. Like the only way to not be Owen's ex in that room was to not be in the room. That was wrong and I could have done it differently. I looked at my coffee. I don't regret building what I built while I was away. Marcus, I met you. I found work I actually cared about. I figured out things about myself I don't think I would have figured out if I'd stayed. But I could have done both. I didn't have to choose. I made it into a choice because I didn't know how to be in a space that had Owen in it without organizing myself around him. And the solution wasn't to remove myself from the space. The solution was to figure out how to just be in it. Which you did, Marcus said. Eventually, I said. 3 years later than I needed to. You did it when you were ready to, he said. Maybe. I looked at him. Or maybe I would have been ready sooner if someone had asked the right question earlier. What was the right question? What do you actually want? I said. Not what makes sense given what happened. What you want. He smiled slightly. That sounds familiar. You asked me that. I did. It helped. I said. He accepted that without making it into more. Which was, again, very Marcus. I want to say something about Owen, not a conclusion. Because this isn't a story that ends with a conclusion about Owen, it ends with a conclusion about me. And the thing about me is the thing I want to leave you with. But Owen deserves something more than a gesture. We're not what we were. We're not going to be what we were. The 1.5 years was real and is finished. And I don't have the feeling about it that the word closure is supposed to produce. But I have something else, something more like the accurate understanding of a thing that happened and what it was and what it cost and what it gave. He was someone I loved. Loving him led me to a group of people who became significant to me. The relationship ending didn't mean I had to return everything that had come with it. I had treated it that way, and I'd been wrong. And I understood now what the wrongness had cost. He's in the room at gatherings. We talk sometimes. The way people who have history and goodwill talk, not as if the history isn't there, but not as if it's the only thing there. We can occupy the same space without either of us doing the work of managing the other's presence. That's not nothing. After 3 years of absence and the weight I'd put on his existence in my mind, the ability to just be in a room with him without it, meaning everything is, actually, quite a lot. The space that had been his, the group, the apartments, the texture of those evenings turned out to be mine too. It had always been mine. I'd given it away as if it were his to give, and it hadn't been his to give, and now I knew that. There's something I want to say to you directly, before the end. When a relationship ends inside a community, when the person you were with is the reason you found the community in the first place, there's a default logic that kicks in. Someone leaves and someone stays. The person who leaves gets distance. The person who stays gets the home court. I believed that logic for 3 years, and it was wrong. Communities don't belong to the person at the center of them. You belong to a friend group because of your presence in it, your history with the specific people in it, the real things that built between you and them over time. And when a relationship ends, you don't owe those real things back. They're yours. The friendships you made are yours. The evenings you were part of are yours. You might need time. I needed time. But time is not the same as permanent exile. And exile is not the only option available. If you've lost a whole social world when a relationship ended, if you're the one who left, or the one who stayed and watched the other person leave and took on the geography of absence, by default, I want you to know that you can go back to the space without going back to the relationship. Those are different things and they don't have to be the same decision. Tell me in the comments if you've been here. I think this is more common than it gets talked about, the loss of community as collateral of the loss of a person. And I think the silence around it makes it harder to navigate than it has to be. Subscribe if you want to stay for more. There's a gathering next week, a Tuesday. Again, Petra texted the group chat. Someone else confirmed they'd come, and the thing materialized the way these things materialize when a group has been together long enough to coalesce around a text message and a free evening. Owen will be there. Most of the original group will be there. Marcus won't be there, because Marcus doesn't know these people, and at some point I might introduce them, but that's a different story for a different time. I'm going to go, not because I've resolved everything or because the 3 years don't exist or because seeing Owen has become uncomplicated. The 3 years are still the 3 years, and seeing Owen is still a thing that contains history, which history always does. I'm going because I decided to go, and the deciding to go is mine, and it's not about Owen or the idea of Owen or what I'm navigating in relation to him. It's just an evening, and I want to be at the evening. 3 years ago, I walked out of a room because I didn't know how to be in it, without him being the reason. I organized my absence around him the same way I had feared I'd organize my presence. Last time I was there, I stayed in a room and he was just someone across from me, and that was fine. He was one person in a room full of people who had also missed me, and I had made him the whole thing when he was never the whole thing. It sounds like nothing. It was everything. And I'm going back next Tuesday for no other reason than that I want to. That's the end of the story and also the beginning of a different one, which is the one where I get to just be somewhere because I chose it. That's what 3 years and 1 evening taught me, and it was worth the cost of learning it, even if I wish I'd learned it sooner.